Welcome to the live stream on an introduction to the Rust programming language as it applies to web development. My name is Prabhu Ishwarla. I am writing this book, Rust Servers, Services and Apps, which is published by Manning, and it's been out in MEEP since December. I've also earlier written another book on in system programming using Rust. I build things with Rust for a living, so that's my background. What are we going to talk about today? It's pretty simple, really. We're going to spend time in the first half to talk about why would you want to think about using Rust for the web, and the second part we'll actually see some code. So that's what we're going to do. In terms of Q&A, we can I can hopefully see your chat room on my other screen. So if you have questions, just type them in, and I'll take them at the appropriate points in the session. So why Rust for web development? You would have, you may be someone joining the stream with some background knowledge of Rust. So you know the basics, and you're probably interested in understanding how Rust can be used for the web. Or you're probably someone who doesn't know what Rust is, and you're here to learn something. Either way, I'll keep this session at a level where we'll discuss the concepts behind the attractiveness of Rust. All right. Let's start with how modern distributed applications are built. It's no longer the case that there are simple three-tier applications. We have a client, we have a server that serves requests, and then there's a database. For a very long time, that was the way applications were built, at least 15, 20 years ago. And since then, with the advent of more mature distributed computing libraries, the server component of applications has started to become more modular. So there's no longer one server that's involved in serving your requests. So if you look at the picture here, if you look at it's a typical stack. So you have networking, then you can host your your workloads on a physical server or on a virtualized server. You can do it on premise. You can do it on the cloud. And on top of that, you have these virtualization technologies like hypervisors, and more recently, cloud native tech has become available. Things like the Dockers and the Kubernetes of the world. But beyond that, right, we get into the application layer. The application layer itself is starting to divide itself into two components. One is the software infrastructure that takes care of all the distribution of software. When you have pieces of an application that are distributed across multiple machines, you need to do the basic plumbing so that these services can find each other, they can talk to each other, they can they can talk to each other synchronously, asynchronously. What happens if one component fails? So bringing in reliability aspects, fault tolerance, had to handle scale. So things like load balancers, proxies, different types of protocols for services to talk to each other. You have things like gRPC and stuff. So all these I would term as part of the distributed software infrastructure stack. And on top of that, you use application components. The application components per se can be as simple as a single binary running on a server, on let's say a Linux server or a Windows server, or they can be microservices which are deployed in a containerized form. Doesn't matter. The point is they're all fine-grained, pieces that are either statically linked together in a binary, or they are dynamically distributed. So that's the application layer. So when today's applications, if you see, they are extremely complex. They are very, very easy to use. When you take when you want to book your cab, when you want to order something from a restaurant, it looks very simple, because I think that is kudos to the front end engineering teams that have made applications so easy to use, even for a child or old people. But there's a lot that goes behind the scenes to make these things work. And all the more so when you talk of scale. The kind of the whole term called web scale applications, wasn't even existent about 15 years ago. The kind of millions of concurrent requests that today's big applications process is simply mind-boggling, and the amount of infrastructure, software and hardware that goes behind making things happen, and the amount of software algorithms, whether it's to do with identifying where you are in the map, where your cab is at any point of time. There's a lot of things that goes on behind the scenes. So even though web applications started off by having simple scripting languages like PHP and stuff, they have come a very long way over the last 15 years. So you have the languages, rise of languages, including Java for the enterprise. You have more client-facing languages, the JavaScripts, whether it's a Ruby, Python. So all of them have come up with web frameworks that sometimes mask some of the limitations of the underlying languages, but they give the developer an experience that makes it that abstracts a lot of the details away, and gives a very fine developer experience. So so basically, what do we need from all these applications? If you look at it, when you look at the need for what do you expect from web applications of today, you look at it from different perspectives, right? As a user, as a business that is providing the service, or as a developer, the perspectives can change. As a user, what I want is something that is that's reliable. So when I type in something in my application, I want to make sure that those requests are recorded. They're not forgotten. They're not dropped. And once I make a request, I know it's going to be processed. Right. I also want my application to be safe, in the sense that I don't want my personal data or financial data to be leaked out. And I don't want my application to crash right in the middle of my transactions. So basically, I need a good usability, and I want reliability. When I look at, I don't really care how many more people are accessing the application at the same time. So scalability is not an issue for me as a user, as an end user. When I look at it from an organizational perspective, one of the primary requirements would be, of course, you want to develop secure applications, because it's bad, press for my business if my customers' data leak out. But I also want stability in operations. I want to make sure that when I develop and deploy applications, then these applications don't core dump, they don't crash, right? They don't hog memory. They don't throw up weird multi-threading kind of errors, because all of these cost money and time to fix, and which means downtime for your business. I also want to make sure that as the number of customers go up, I don't want to linearly increase the amount of hardware and software that I'm throwing to keep these running. I want to make sure these programs don't hog resources; they are resource efficient. Resource in the sense they utilize the CPUs, the memories, the disk space, the networking bandwidth, all these things. Now, there are also aspects around when at scale, at very high scale, I want to make sure that my users get the right response time. They don't have to keep waiting for many seconds for a page to load or for a screen to show up. So latency becomes a very important aspect. And last but not least, I want more business, more customers coming in, right, which means more revenue. So these are some of the things from the perspective of someone who's running a business. And last but not least, which is a developer perspective, of course, we want to write safe, secure applications, because we value good software engineering as engineers. But at the same time, we want to be cognizant of our employers or our customers' requirements in terms of developing efficient software. And latency and concurrency, I want to be able to develop software which can give me the best possible or the lowest possible latency times and high concurrency without having to do a lot of work, right? I don't want to get into a lot of the low level plumbing. I'm very interested to make sure that I get a good developer experience. So these are different perspectives, but regardless, I would say that these are the key points that we look at when we develop modern web applications. As a secondary requirement today, with the advent of things like serverless technologies, I want to reduce my bootstrapping time. When I want to start up a component, when the request comes in, I start up, process the request, and then send the response back, then shut down the system or shut down the component. So I want to make sure that those startup shutdown times are low. As applications become complex, which is inevitable. Any real world application gets more and more complex over time. There are more people coming in who are going to maintain the system. How easy is it for me to refactor a code base that's been written not by me but by someone months or years ago? Is a very important consideration, because if you look at the life cycle of software development, one thing that has not changed is that the maintenance life cycle, is far longer than the development life cycle, right? Because systems tend to have a unique way of remaining in production for very long. Even today, you see applications running that were built, 30 years ago, in languages like COBOL. So I would say these are some of the requirements that we expect, we've come to expect from web applications. So let's take each point and talk about it. So we will start with safety. When we talk about Rust, I think one of the primary USPs of Rust that people talk about is the safety aspect of Rust. So what is safety? Safety is like multi-headed beast. So the first aspect of safety is to do with types, the data types. Now there are programming languages that are statically typed, and there are dynamically typed languages. In dynamically typed languages, at compilation time, you don't know what value is going to be associated with a variable. So the compilers or the interpreters make some smart choices at runtime. They do some inference, and based on that, they do the calculations. But this gives rise to a lot of uncertainty or non-deterministic behavior when it comes to putting things in production. So Rust is a language which is statically typed, which means you know upfront what kind of value you're going to store in a variable. And if you don't do that, the compiler will make sure that where you don't specify explicit types for a value or a variable, then the compiler will try to infer it. If it cannot infer, it will not let you proceed. So the Rust compiler I'm going to be talking about a lot during this session, because that's you can have a love-hate relationship with your compiler. On one hand, it's the one that's going to frustrate you as you work in Rust. On the other hand, it's your best friend. So type safety is a key aspect of Rust. The second, and I would say, I would argue, or some would argue, the most important, most unique thing about Rust is its memory safety model. I'm going to spend a little bit more to talk about memory safety, and maybe I will, rather than talk through a slide, let me show you some code. Are there any questions so far? So let's go to Rust Playground. It is an online IDE that's available, so you can quickly try out some code. Okay, so what I'm going to show you is to understand Rust's memory safety model. There is this unique concept called ownership in Rust. So I'm going to explain to you through, or try and explain to you through some code samples how this works. So let's start with, you know, some examples. So first, I'm going to show you talk to you about some of the key rules of memory management. The first thing is that in Rust, by default, all variables are immutable. And when you move a value to another owner, or when you do an assignment operation, by default, stack allocated variables, the basic primitive types like the integers, the booleans, and things, they are by default copy operations. Okay, but the heap allocated variables like the strings and the vectors, they are move operations, and I'm going to show you what that means here. So by default, let's look at what does a move operation mean in Rust. The second thing is I'm going to show you is when moving is not the only way to deal with values. Sometimes I don't want to move ownership from one value to another. What I want to do is I want to be able to borrow a value. So I'll show you how you can borrow values between variables, one in an immutable way, and you can also do it in a mutable way, mutable borrow. Then the fourth rule of memory safety or ownership I'll talk to you about is how does Rust do memory management, especially the deallocation of memory. So we'll talk about how the value is destroyed, deallocated, and last but not least, when you borrow a value from a variable, then Rust makes sure that the reference to a value does not outlive the value. So let's look at this. So these are I think if you distill Rust's ownership model, there's of course a lot more nuances. But if you understand these five key aspects, it will give you an idea of what is unique about Rust's memory management model. Let's start with the move operation. So let's say I declare a variable. Okay, it's of type integer. Okay, and I assign a value to it. If I declare another variable, I hope you can see my screen, and I assign the value of x into y. So just to clarify the terminology, value and variable. Value is what is actually stored in memory, and a variable is just a name that refers to that location in memory. Okay, so in this case, what happens if I do a print? If I say value of x is and I'll do the same thing with y. All right, so I'm going to run this program. So at the bottom part of the screen, you can actually see the result. You can see that the value of x and y are printed. So what this means is that when you are doing an assignment operator, right, on a primitive data type, the basic data type like an integer, the value, when you do an assignment, the value of 5 is copied from x to y, which means at the end of the operation, both x and y have got the same value associated with it. Okay, so this is a very basic operation. Now, and this is the case in many programming languages. But what becomes interesting is when you look at, instead of a basic type, I mean, if you try the same thing with something like a Boolean, also the same, it will happen. You just copy the values. Yeah. But if let's say we declare a type string. A string is a string is a dynamically allocated variable because you don't know upfront what is the length of string. In the case of integer, if you say I32, you're talking of 32 bits or 4 bytes. The compiler knows it can allocate so much of memory. When you talk of a string, you don't know what is the length of the string that you're going to get, when you're running the program. So in this case, what Rust's memory management system does is it allocates a set of memory in the heap area of the process. So let me initialize x with a value. Now let's try to assign this, right? We're assigning the value of x to y. So in this case, the compiler is smart enough. I don't have to explicitly declare the type like this. I can do it if I want to, or I don't need to, because the compiler will be smart enough to infer that y is also of type string because I'm doing an assignment operator. So let's try to run this program. So you will see that the compiler will complain because it says, look at this. The compiler error messages in Rust are one of some of the most helpful I've seen. So look at this. It says borrow of moved value x. So what this means is that the value of x has been moved to y. Okay. Unlike in the case of integers where the value of x was copied into y, here the value of x is moved into y. So it's able to print x, it cannot print y. It's able to print y, it cannot print x because the value of x has already been moved, so it doesn't know what to print. So this is ownership in action in Rust, which means the heap allocated values are moved by default. Okay. Now, what this means is that at any point of time, you just have one owner for a value, and the compiler tracks the ownership of a value through its life cycle. Okay, and that's a very, very powerful concept. So what happens at the end of it, what it does is, when the owner of the value, let's say in this case, y is the owner of the value. Here, x is the owner of the value. Hello. When you move it to y becomes the new owner. So this way, as through the program, the compiler checks where all the value gets assigned to, and that's an important aspect of Rust's ownership model. Yeah. The next one I want to talk to you about is borrowing. So when moving values between variables is one thing. But there could be times when I don't want to be the owner of some piece of data. I just want to borrow it for some time, and I want to give it back to you. So let's look at that example. We'll comment this. So let's do the same thing again. Declare a type of string, initialize it. So string.from is a method available on the string data type, which lets you create a string type from a static set of text. Right. So now let's create a variable y, and this time y is going to borrow the value of x. So it's unlike the previous case where we moved the value. You see this ampersand. The ampersand represents a reference to a value. Okay. It's kind of like pointers in C++, but it's not the same. So here what happens is I can try to print out the values of x and y. So let's see what happens. Okay, so here I'm able to print out the value. You see this? So just by borrowing a value, I no longer am constrained by the move semantics, because now it's no longer move, it's borrow semantics. So I have borrowed the value of x and the y. So both y has access to data, x also has access to the same piece of data, which is the hello value. So this is called an immutable borrow. It's called immutable borrow because I'm just borrowing the data. I have no intention of modifying this value. The value of x, I don't want to modify. I just want to use it, read it, and maybe do something with it. Okay, so that's an immutable borrow. Now, there will be situations when you write a program where you want to borrow a value but also modify it. Yeah? So let's look at that as the third case. And that's called the mutable borrowing situation. So just going to copy paste. It's faster. Right. Now this time I'm going to try and borrow, this time with a mute keyword. So this is the way you borrow mutably. The first thing is when you declare x, you have to say it's a mutable value. So this is very important because by default, all variables are immutable. So when I just say, let me just show you that. If I just say that x, it's x, and if I try to modify the value of x, right, let me say I'm going to append something to the string. So there is a utility method here, and I just want to say hello there. So all I'm doing is I've created x, and then I'm just trying to append something to it. You see, it says you cannot borrow x is mutable because by default, everything is immutable in Rust. Why this benefits is that you don't accidentally modify a value which you don't intend to. So the compiler expects you to be very explicit about this. And so if you have any intention of modifying the value, you must specify the mute keyword so that the compiler knows that you want to do some state changing operation with that value. So now if you run the program, yeah, it goes through. So you're able to assign it. So let's go back to our example. And here what we're going to do is assign, borrow the value of x mutably. So create a variable called y, and then mutable value of x. And then now let me try to modify y. Now that y has got a copy of the data, not the copy of the data. It has a reference to the data that is owned by x, but y should be able to modify that value. So let's do that here. And we'll print out the values of x and y. See what happens here. Okay, now you'll find an error which looks weird. It says you cannot borrow x as immutable because it's also borrowed as mutable. So what this means is that when you're actually trying to print something, implicitly the value of x is borrowed immutably, right? Now Rust's ownership rules state that when you are borrowing x mutably, already you've done this. You see the statement in line number 18. You're already borrowing the value of x mutably. When you have already a mutable reference outstanding, you cannot have any more references to the same value, whether it is mutable or immutable. And that's why you're seeing this. So let me remove the statement and try to print it. Okay, so here it is. So this is an important rule, ownership rule, which says that once you borrow a value mutably, the same value cannot be borrowed immutably or mutably, which means at any point of time, there's only one reference to a value. Now, these are very powerful primitives to make sure that memory is handled in a very safe manner. Because the moment you have a reference and you pass it around to multiple variables, and each one has got the opportunity to modify it in unpredictable ways. So by design, Rust prevents these kinds of situations. Right? So that's where all these ownership rules come in. So that's the mutable borrow. Now let's look at we've seen how to move a value, how to borrow mutably and immutably. Now, what is unique about Rust's ownership model is not just these move and borrow semantics, but the point is that I don't have, as a developer, I don't have to remember to deallocate memory when I no longer need it. Now, this is one of the biggest challenges when you use low-level languages like C or C++, because unless you are a very diligent and experienced programmer, these forgetting to release memory at the right time can either result in situations where you have things like null pointer dereferencing, so those kinds of things will arise, which or you have dangling pointers. So these things can be completely avoided, or they are completely avoided in Rust, because Rust doesn't even let you do that. What Rust does is that it does the automatic deallocation of memory for you when the owner goes out of scope. So I'll show you this with an example before we talk more about it. So we'll take the same example again. Let's declare X. I'm just leaving these in there so that you can refer back to it if you want to rewatch the stream. Okay, so let's do this. So I'm going to create another lexical scope within the scope. So if you see this pair of enclosing braces, within the main program, I'm actually creating this a statement within this block. And then let me try to access the value of X outside of this block. Yeah. You see, it says it cannot find value of X in the scope. Right? You will say, of course, it's in scope because it's in part of the main program. Right? This is the main program, and I have it in scope. But the way Rust evaluates scope is that this has been declared within this inner block, okay? And you're trying to access the value of X outside this inner block. So what is happening here is that within the block, Rust is allocating memory, and it's assigning the pointer to the memory to the variable X. But the moment it sees this closing brace, it treats it as the end of scope of the owner of the value, which is X, and X no longer exists once you come out of the scope. And so at this point of time, what Rust does is it deallocates the memory associated with hello. So that memory is free to be reallocated to some other, someone else requesting for memory. And so that's called that's known as the dropped rate in Rust. So by default, Rust implements the dropped rates for most of the standard types. And if you have your own custom type, you can specify what you want as part of the drop operation. But essentially, the power of this is Rust enables you to do low-level memory management without using a garbage collector. So if you look at most of the so-called safe, this dichotomy between high-level and low-level languages is also about safety versus performance as a trade-off. If you look at high-level languages like Java, the Pythons, the Rubies, JavaScript, all these are treated as high-level, not because they are this thing, but because they make it easy for you to write safe programs. You can write safe programs from the point of view of memory safety, because a lot of this plumbing is taken care of by the by your runtimes there, whether the compilers or the interpreters or the JVMs. They take care of the automatic memory management for you. Rust allows you to do automatic memory management without a garbage collector. At the same time, you have low-level control over how you allocate memory. So I think that is where the power of Rust comes from. So that's the deallocation, how it releases memory. And the last aspect I want to talk to you about when it comes to memory safety is that remember we spoke about how you can borrow a value. Now let's again do that. Let's create a variable, and let's borrow a value. This time we'll do an immutable borrow. We don't need mute. So again, let's put this within a block to simulate scope. So within the, we are declaring a variable y outside the block. Okay. Now within the block, we're declaring a value of x, and within the block, we are allocating, or we are borrowing the value of x here. All right. It's pretty simple. I've just created a variable. I'm borrowing the value of x and assigning it to y. Okay. Now here, if I try to print out the value, this should work. The value of y should work. Now let me just delete this one. Okay, so you see that within the block, you can actually access the value of y, and you can print it out. But let's see what happens if I just move this print statement outside of this block. It doesn't compile because it tells you x does not live long enough. What this means is that, because x has been declared within the scope, once x goes out of scope, that memory has been deallocated. But what is happening is, you see this, the value of y, y is still, y's lifetime is still not completed, which means y is still alive and kicking. So when you, here, this is a case of a dangling pointer. Y has got a reference to x, and that, where the value of x has been deallocated. So classic case of dangling pointer. And Rust tells you upfront that you're trying to do this. It will not allow you to go forward. So what Rust is doing is, it's trying to make sure that the reference to a value does not outlive the value itself, right? The reference to a value can, the lifetime of a reference to a value can be less than or equal to the lifetime of the value. And that's what Rust ensures. And all this is done through static checks at compilation time. You're not going to get any weird runtime errors because because you forgot to do the right sequencing of these statements. Okay, so what we've seen are 5 important rules. One, we've seen that 5 or 6 important rules. One is, by default, everything is a move operation in Rust for heap allocated variables. Then we saw how you can borrow a value immutably. You can borrow a value mutably. We've seen how Rust deallocates memory when the owner of the value goes out of scope. And we've also seen how Rust tracks the references with respect to the values and make sure that the reference to a value does not outlive the value. It could be a lot if you're coming in from another programming language, but there's no point just telling you that memory is safe in Rust, unless you get a glimpse of what that means. And these are the foundational concepts of Rust. As you can see, as we go through even simple programs, the compiler will hit you very hard. It will tell you you can't go forward, and you have to accommodate the compiler. But at the end of the day, one thing that I have personally realized is, once you have a program that has gone through all the compiler checks, a lot of downstream problems you avoid. So that's a good thing. So you can be secure that you're not going to get unpredictable errors at runtime. So that's memory safety in a nutshell for you. Okay. I'm not sure if I can see your questions or what, but okay. All right. So we spoke about type safety and memory safety. Let's look at thread safety as the next aspect. Now, what is thread safety? Thread safety is about not having data races. So when you have a piece of data, a piece of memory that's accessed by multiple threads, different threads of execution run within a process memory, right? So multiple threads share the same memory of a single process. And when you're trying to access a value of associated with a variable, at a particular memory location. If two threads try to write to the same piece of memory, then you have what are known as these data race conditions, because one thread is trying to read something and another thread is trying to write the same data. So these are some of the most difficult problems to debug, especially in production when you write multi-threaded programs. That's why many programs take the easier, many languages take the easy route of using single-threaded semantics. But Rust, interestingly, not just provides memory safety, it actually prevents data races from happening. And for thread safety, it doesn't use a completely different set of concepts. It actually uses the same concepts that we saw for memory safety. The same concepts of ownership, mutable, immutable borrowing, and reference lifetimes. The same thing can be applied for thread safety also, because think about it. You can think about we saw how the value the owner of a value moves from variable x to y. So likewise, you can think of the ownership of a value moving from one thread to another. So otherwise the same rules apply, and Rust has got more built-in support to ensure you write thread safe program. If I have time, I can show you more details, but let me just quickly run through the rest of the material. So these are some of the, and in addition to the ownership semantics, there are other aspects of safety. Pattern matching is more exhaustive in Rust. You don't get into bounds checks. You don't try to access an array that is array element beyond its range. So those kind of things are prevented in Rust. Okay, now let's go to the next one. So we saw about memory, about safety itself. Let's talk about how Rust is resource efficient. So as you've seen, Rust allows you to define the memory layout of a program. You can define what parts of your application you want to process in the stack, which ones you want to process on the heap. You can define how much of memory you want to allocate to each of them, and you can define when something goes out of scope. So there's a lot of things you can do to. You can also say which ones are accessible over multiple threads. So all these things you can do in Rust. Rust also helps you write programs that utilize multiple cores. Resource efficiency is really about how do you utilize your CPU cores, your memory, your disk, your network, so efficiently. So that's what it is. So we spoke about how you can have memory, tight memory control in Rust. The other aspect is these today's CPUs are hitting the limits of how much of transistors you can compress in a small area. So the Moore's law is really no longer going to be valid going forward. So what this means is that CPU manufacturers are coming up with ways by which you can have multiple cores rather than have everything in a single core. But the point is, it's not enough to have multiple cores. When you buy a computer, they'll tell you they have these 2-core processor, 4-core processor, but that's meaningless unless your program is able to take advantage of those multiple cores. So Rust enables you to do that. Rust supports the built-in multi-threading model where you can, for example, allocate one thread per core, and you can process multiple things concurrently. So apart from that, things like memory leaks by default, as you saw, are prevented. For example, the compiler doesn't wait for you to release memory; it will automatically release memory when a variable goes out of scope. So those kind of things go a long way towards making sure that you don't run into situations where you alloc but you don't dealloc a piece of memory. Now, this is not to say that you cannot have memory leaks in Rust. There are some situations where you can, but by and large, for the regular conditions, it prevents mistakes. Also, because Rust does not have a garbage collector, garbage collectors typically have their run in their own threads. They consume processes. Periodically, they run and clear memory. So those kind of overheads are not there. Especially if you look at languages like Java, the JVM is a huge memory hogger, right? So because of the lack of GC, the memory utilization is a lot more tighter. And Rust has got a small footprint. You can run it on embedded systems, bare metal servers. Even if you look at the optimized size of binaries that are created, the compiler team has done a lot of work to make sure you're able to create optimized size. Uh, so these are some of the ways by which Rust makes sure it utilizes your, the processors and memory and threads, and has a small footprint. And it's having a small footprint is not, when you think about from an organization's perspective, obviously, today the conventional thinking is that, okay, memory is cheap, or disk is cheap, let's just throw in more, spin in one more virtual machine and do it, right? But that kind of thinking, you don't have to, is not the default thinking in Rust. You can actually specify, you can control every aspect of it and make sure that you get more bang for your buck, so to speak. When you hire resources on the cloud, you can extract much more performance out of it when you use a language like Rust. Another aspect of web applications is to do with low latency. Okay, what is latency? Latency is basically a combination of, when you have a make a web request, HTTP request, get back a response. There are two components at play here. One is your network latency, which depends on what's your overall network bandwidth, how efficient is your router, what kind of, you're using a fiber, you're using whatever transmission medium, and how long the distances between servers are and clients are. So those kind of aspects come into play, and those things you can't do much from a programming language perspective. But what is in the control of a programming language is your service latency. So when you develop a service using a language, if you look at where some of the delays happen, a lot of the delays, especially in web applications, are to do with I/O handling. So web applications don't necessarily tend to be computation intensive; they are more I/O intensive, which means you most of the time, a lot of the time, you actually read and write from the disk, the database access, the queries, and stuff like that. So that's where a lot of the latency comes in. Also, when you typically when you switch across threads, very frequently there's a context switching time. There could be pauses associated with hypervisors, garbage collectors. These are all the contributors to service latency. But because Rust, allows you very low level control over resources, and it doesn't have a garbage collector, actually very minimal runtime, and it's got a very good story when it comes to IO, non-blocking IO handling. It's got the primitives built into the programming language, like futures, async, and await. So because of all these reasons, you can build services with Rust, web services and network services in Rust that have low latency. Okay. Moving on to concurrency. Rust supports two types of concurrency. One is the classic multi-threading, and the next is asynchronous I/O. So these are the two broad models that you use for writing concurrent programs. So Rust supports both shared memory and message passing concurrency, so which means that you can access the same piece of memory. You can put a mutex lock over it, when you're sharing across threads, and then safely access or mutate a value, or you can even pass a value between threads. So these are ways by which two pieces of software or components can share and exchange information. Likewise, I spoke to you about asynchronous I/O. Asynchronous I/O is over and above multi-threading. Okay, so within a single thread, you can apply asynchronous I/O. Across multiple threads, you can have multiple execution tasks, but within a single thread, you can actually, let's say you hit a situation where you get a web request, and then you are trying to access a database, that takes a little time. In the meantime, you can do other tasks. So that's what asynchronous I/O is about. So Rust supports both models. So I've spent time talking about this because this is really the crux of some of the reasons why you would think of using Rust for web development. We've seen the safety and security, the reliability, resource efficiency, and concurrence, handling highly concurrent requests coming in and minimizing latency. So that's the thing. So any questions so far? Yeah, I'm not sure I can see any questions here. Okay, let me just move on. Well, we've seen some aspects, but over and above this, Rust is also a productive language from a developer perspective. We spoke about the different, perspectives of the users versus businesses versus developers. Now we're going to talk about for developers, what's in it for us. I mean, what's in it for developers? Uh, some of these things which I've personally found appealing are the functional programming, like constructs that are available where functions are first-class citizens. You can pass them around. Closures are like functions, but they can capture the surrounding environment. You have iterators which make you can use them as a replacement for your for loops, but these are safer and nicer to use. You can do meta programming using generics and macros. Enums are a good way to minimize the number of possible values a variable can take. Error handling is pretty nice with Rust. It doesn't use exception handling, but by default, the Rust's philosophy is if a function or a piece of code can encounter an error, it returns what is known as a result data type. A result data type is an enum. If there's a successful value, it returns it. Otherwise, it throws an error. So when you have functions returning result, what it tells you is that there is a possibility of an error. And when there's a possibility of an error, the calling function can then decide what to do with the error that comes back. You can handle it, you can recover it, you can abort, panic, you can do what you want with it. But there are a lot of good constructs to remove boilerplate code for error handling. It also supports polymorphism through traits. Traits are not like interfaces. If you know languages like Golang, they're more like interfaces. And there are dynamic dispatch and things like that. So there are many of these features that make programming in Rust very, very, at least for me, it's a delightful experience. Now, no discussion is complete if I only tell you one side of the story. Before you think of adopting Rust for web development, uh, especially web development, now this is true for any programming you do in Rust, but in web development, because there are a lot of good frameworks, whether you're coming from Ruby with Ruby on Rails, whether you're doing Python with Django or Flask, or you're doing Spring with Java, Node.js, a lot of these frameworks have kind of spoiled developers, with their easy to use semantics and abstractions. So if you directly uh, compare that with developing in Rust, you will find that Rust has a steep learning curve. I can do a lot of web programming in Ruby without understanding too much of Ruby. I can do a lot of web programming in JavaScript without understanding too much of JavaScript, because the web frameworks kind of they give you specific points at which I have to write some piece of code, and it's it makes programming a lot easier. Now it looks like magic because you don't really know what's happening under the hood, but from a developer experience perspective, especially first time developers, they find it easy to pick up languages like JavaScript because these framework make it easy, or Python for that matter. Rust is not like that. You must be willing to invest time upfront and get frustrated, but persevere with the learning process. But that is I think one of the biggest pitfalls of Rust. If you before you think about adopting, unless you're convinced about the philosophy of Rust that I spent about 40 minutes or so talking about, I don't think Rust is for you. Right? You must be convinced that this helps you write good software. This helps you write good software for yourself and for your customers and for your employers. If you don't have that firm conviction, Rust is not for you. But if you like what you've seen, then I would say you should plan to invest time to learn Rust. There are some data structures more difficult. Say, oh, I can do this very easily in Java. Of course, there are some things you can do easier in other programming languages, but because of Rust's ownership model, certain things are more difficult to do. The compiler is improving, but it's still slower. If you look at a compiler of Golang, it's much faster than this. But Rust is getting there. It's the core team is working on improving this ecosystem. Naturally, when you don't just rely on the standard libraries of any programming language. You rely on the ecosystem of open source ecosystem that helps you do whatever you want to do. Whether you want to do API authentication with JWT, you want to do CORS handling,
You want to do database access, you want to do serialization, deserialization, you want some middleware, whatever. There are standard things you do in web development. You want an ecosystem that can help you do all these things without writing it from scratch. Now, the ecosystem of Rust has evolved, over the last couple of years, at least from a web development perspective, but there's still more to go. You can't compare it with, let's say, Node.js yet. Uh, because the language is new, if you're a manager looking to hire Rust web developers, it's going to take a while. And enterprise blessing of enterprises. I think very recently there's been an alliance formed, with companies like Mozilla, Google, and Amazon, who are now firmly behind Rust, which is a very positive development. So I would say, that aspect is getting addressed. Okay, so I've spoken about the Rust web development stack. I mean, I've spoken about Rust's philosophy. I'll quickly talk about what does web development stack in Rust look like. At the base of everything is Rust's tool, which is Cargo. Cargo is primarily a build and dependency management tool. It's again a very nice tool if you haven't used it. Uh, uh, it also helps you do built-in automated test management. It does the standard formatting and linting and stuff like that. It can generate documentation for you. But by and large, Cargo takes care of a lot of your, build time tasks, and there's a lot of configuration you can do to optimize your builds, whether for development, for production. You can cross compile to other targets, different CPU architectures. So all that Cargo takes care of. Then you have the Rust core language. The core language consists of the language primitives, the basic types, and there's also a standard library which has tons of functionality. Whether you want to starting with you want to do memory management, you want to do networking, you want to do multi-threading, you want to do functional programming. So all those primitives are built into the standard library. Then there is also an optional async runtime you can use. Right, you can always write web servers without using async. Just with multi-threading, you can write thing. But here is a representative stack which I have adopted in the book, and which uses an async runtime. And then what this does is it helps you, because web development, as I told you, is a lot about I/O and less about computation. So async model of concurrency assumes a greater significance here, and that's why I've chosen to use an async runtime, or a web framework that supports an async runtime. And then on top of this, you have web application frameworks and crates. So what do web application frameworks do in Rust? Just like any other language, you can handle the route, the dependencies, errors, request and response, processing, parsing, middleware. You can host static pages, you can render templates, you can do compression. All those standard things that you've come to expect from web frameworks are available with Rust as well. And in addition, there are third-party high-quality libraries available for things like serializing, deserializing your data as it goes over the network, for accessing different types of databases, Postgres, MySQL, MongoDB, whatever you can access. You can do authentication, you can do gRPC, GraphQL. So all these things, there are libraries available. The reason I'm putting these up is because these are some of the things people working in the web development domain would want to know. Can I do all this in Rust? Yes, you can. Today you can do it. And here is a representative instantiation of the stack. So you can use Rust here. You can use Tokio, which is a very popular and kind of the more mature this thing async runtime, which is used by Actix Web. Actix is the framework I've chosen for the book. Now there are other frameworks available like Rocket and Warp. Now it's always a difficult discussion to say why I chose one framework or language over another. So just like I spoke about the benefits of Rust vis-a-vis other languages, I'm not going to talk about the benefit of Actix vis-a-vis Rocket and stuff, because end of the day, if you see, a lot of the power, maybe unlike other programming languages where, let's say, you have Django and Flask, and you compare them on different parameters. Whereas when it comes to comparing web frameworks and Rust, a lot of the benefits or the strengths of doing web development come from Rust itself. They don't come from the framework. So actually, in a way, it doesn't matter what framework you use. You can use Rocket, you can use Actix, whatever you want. But the power of Rust actually comes shining through any web framework that you use. So this is a representative stack. You pick a stack and you go with it. And I've chosen the Actix because as of the time of writing, it is the most mature and the most feature set wise. It's some of the most complete also, and it's also stable. It's been tested in production. I have personally deployed applications with Actix in production, so that's where my affinity to Actix comes from. But if you want to use Rocket, it's also a good framework. All right. I've also chosen to use SQLX as the database access layer. There are ORMs available for people like familiar with Ruby and other languages with ORMs. There's something called Diesel available in Rust. You can use that, but I've chosen not to use it. I've used something more low level, which is SQLX, which gives you more control. Okay. All right. So that's what I wanted to cover. Actually, I wanted to show you some coding as well, but I think we are already at the end of an hour. So maybe it's going to be another stream sometime, but I can show you some code. Or actually, maybe I'll show you some code quickly if you guys want to look at it. So I'm going to show you some simple basic code that gives you a feel for what programming in Rust looks like. This probably will take another 10-15 minutes or so. Yeah, that's okay. So let's create a new project in Rust using Cargo. So let's say I just want to write a simple greeting web service. All right. So by default, the Cargo tool creates some scaffolding for you. So it creates. Let's go to the directory. So it creates. Of course, it gives you some built-in Git stuff, but it creates a TOML file, which is a configuration file where you can specify your dependencies and build options and all that, compiler options, and then there is a source directory. Okay, so let's look at what this is. So this is the Cargo TOML file. So this is where you specify all your dependencies, and then by default it comes with some simple hello world type of code. Okay, so what we're going to do is for developing a simple web service in Rust, what we're going to do is we're going to first add the dependency to import the web framework. So let's go to Cargo TOML, and all you have to do is say Actix Web, and I'm going to use version 3, which is the current version. So Rust uses the Cargo uses semantic versioning, if you're familiar with it. So once I specify dependencies, the first time I try to build or compile or run it, then what Cargo will do is automatically download the dependencies. Okay. So how you do that? Let's say you just do a Cargo check. So you do a Cargo check. What it does, it just we haven't saved it. Yeah. So if you see that now it's detected the fact that we have a crate. Crate is what you call in Rust a library. So it's detected a crate and it's trying to download. Yeah, you can see it's trying to download all the dependencies and building it. compiling it basically. The binary is not created with check, but it compiles the downloaded dependency sources. So let's, in the meanwhile, let's write some code. So for Actix, I'll just open the Actix repository so that you know what we're doing. So go to crates.io. It's the public repository of all Rust's third-party crates, and this is where the ecosystem resides of libraries and frameworks. So you can go to Actix web. Let's go to API documentation. All right, so this is important for programming. You understand what are the modules that are available to you, what are the structs, and what are the enums, what are the traits. So when you do Rust programming, these are the things you worry about. So what we're going to do now is import some of these modules and structures. So let's do this. We're going to say use Actix web, and then you import what module you want. We're going to import a few modules here. I'll show you what they are. So we'll pick this HTTP server, which is a core request, and it does the parsing of HTTP messages and constructing the responses back in line with the specification. We'll pick this app structure, which represents a web application. We will also use the web helper module. It's got methods for doing route registration and some handler functionality. Okay. And we use errors mostly. So let's use app HTTP server, HTTP response, and maybe errors. So I don't need this. I can just save it. So what we've done is basically imports. Then there are two more things you have to do. You have to actually define a handler, and then you have to define the main function. Okay. Let's start with the handler. What a handler does is when there's an incoming HTTP request, a handler processes that request and it sends back an HTTP response. And because we're using an async runtime, right, the functions have to be annotated with the async keyword. You say async function. We're going to write a simple hello or a health check handler. And we're going to return a result type that I spoke to you about briefly. It returns an HTTP response and error. So if the handler functionality is successful, it returns an HTTP response. Otherwise, it returns an error. So here, all we're going to do is we're going to return HTTP response. We'll construct the response using some helper methods. Body, then say hi there. Okay. Now note that there's no semicolon at the end. By default, when you don't put a semicolon, in Rust functions, it is treated as the return value. So this is returned back. Now, because we're returning a result type, right, not HTTP response raw, so we have to encapsulate it within the OK variant. So this is a simple handler function. Now we're going to write the main function. Just say Actix web. Again, this is an async function. Right. So what we'll do is we have to first, create an app instance and register routes, whatever you call it, and then you start the HTTP server. Very simple. How do you create an app instance? Let's say we'll use a closure and say app new. You create a new instance of an Actix web application, and then you register a route. A route has got three parts. It's got the basic path which you use, and then it's got the HTTP method you're going to use, and then the handler for processing it. Those are the three parts to it. So let's say I want a health endpoint. I want a get method, and then this is the handler function. So what this is doing is I'm actually creating a new app instance. I'm registering a route. A route consists of a path or an endpoint. It has an HTTP method, and what does the handler function. So if there is an incoming request on this path /health, and if it's a get request, what the framework does is it invokes this handler. It routes the request to this health check handler. And what the health check handler does is it actually simply returns back a static piece of text that is encapsulated in the body of an HTTP response. That's all this program is doing. And lastly, what we do is we actually start. It's not enough to just create a web application. You need some place where you can host the web application. That's the HTTP server. So let's create an HTTP server. Okay, we create a new instance of server, and we pass the application instance with it. Okay. Then what do you do when you start a server? The first thing is you have to bind it to a port, because the server is a long-running program. It will listen on a port. So you use the bind method, and then let's say you specify a simple okay. Now this is an operation that can fail, right? When you're trying to bind to a port, it's possible that port 3000 is already being used, for example. So it returns a result type. So you must recognize that possibility of it returning an error type. And what we're doing is we're unwrapping that error. So if the error happens, the program will abort. Otherwise, it will continue. And then we're saying you run the server after you bind to the port. And last but not least, you use the await syntax. What the await syntax does is in Rust, the closures and the futures, they are what are known as lazily evaluated. What this means is unless you mention the await keyword, none of these steps will take place. The server will not create a new app and bind to a port and run unless you use the await keyword. Okay, and this Actix web main annotation is basically recognizing the fact that we are using an async runtime. So when you use an async runtime, you have to yield control back to the task scheduler of the async runtime, which is in this case Actix has got its own version of the Tokio runtime. So you're saying that the entry point to this web application or the web service is this main function, which is an async function, and that you're annotating by using this Actix web main this thing. So that's it. So we've written a function. Let's see what is. Okay, it's saying because web. Okay. So let's go back here. So it's still downloading stuff, dependencies. So this is really what a program looks like. Now, if you all you have to do is you just have to run the program, and the program starts. I'll tell you what happens when you actually run a program. I have probably a slide here. Okay. So this is the architecture of how things work. So you have a mobile or a web client from which you send an HTTP request over the internet. And this is the Actix web server. That is the container. Okay. So the HTTP web server of Actix intercepts the HTTP request, parses it, right? And then what it does is it checks what is the HTTP method and the route on which the request is coming in. Then it invokes the application, the Actix application, and routes that to the appropriate handler, health check handler. Okay. Likewise, on the return path, it it sends back the request, constructs a well-formed HTTP response, and the client sees this thing. Right. So this is how you write a simple program in Rust. a simple web service basically. Okay, this is what I wanted to show you. Uh, so, so with this, I think we can, I can conclude my session. We've basically seen, if you go back to the agenda, we've seen the reasons for why somebody would want to use Rust for web development. We've also seen some code for to get an idea of what it feels to do, web development in Rust, and that's it. I think so. If you're, if you think you are interested in doing web development in Rust, a discount code is available for my book, which you can use. All right. I think if there are any questions, maybe I'm not able to see your questions. I don't know. Should I be logged in or? Okay, so I think we can conclude the session. Thank you so much for watching, and goodbye.